December 1757. Inside the dim chambers of St. James's Palace, a princess of Britain writhed in agony from unrelenting intestinal pain. She was Princess Caroline, daughter of King George II, sister to monarchs who shaped Europe. Yet unlike them, she never married, never ruled, never left heirs. At just 44, her life ended in silence. Her fate, erased from grandeur, became the forgotten mirror of countless invisible princesses history chose not to remember. She was born in the summer of 1713. Her cradle stood not in London, but in Herrenhausen, Hanover, a palace surrounded by gardens, fountains, and carefully trimmed hedges. Her name was Caroline. From her very first breath, she belonged to two worlds: the small German electorate where her father ruled, and the distant island kingdom he would one day inherit. At that moment, she was not extraordinary. She was not a future queen. She was not a destined bride promised to a powerful throne. She was simply the fourth surviving daughter of George Augustus of Hanover and his wife, Caroline of Ansbach. A princess, yes. But in a family overflowing with princes and princesses, she seemed more like a piece in a crowded chessboard than a figure of singular importance. Life in Hanover was orderly, strict, and somewhat provincial. Caroline's childhood days were filled with lessons in French, music, and the etiquette of courtly life. She learned to curtsy properly, to play the harpsichord, to read both scripture and poetry. Like all daughters of her rank, she was raised to be useful, not to inherit. Her brothers would fight for crowns and military commands. Her sisters would be bargained away in marriage negotiations. Caroline, though young, must have understood that her life was a story already outlined by others. And yet, change loomed on the horizon. In 1714, her grandfather, Elector George of Hanover, was suddenly elevated to King of Great Britain after the death of Queen Anne. The crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland passed to him, not because of love or loyalty, but because of bloodline and Protestant faith. The Hanoverians, once German princes, were now monarchs of an island realm they barely knew. Caroline was only a child when the family prepared for this transformation. She watched her father, now Prince of Wales, quarrel openly with her grandfather, the new George I. She saw her mother maneuver gracefully through political storms, offering both counsel and charm. And she herself became one of the little faces in a royal portrait suddenly transplanted to England. The move to London changed everything. The language was different. The court was suspicious. The Hanoverians were mocked as foreigners, derided for their accents, and resented for their power. For a girl of 7 or 8, these whispers must have been confusing. She was both at the center of splendor and yet an outsider in the very country that now called her princess. But childhood has a way of softening political storms. Caroline grew up within St. James's Palace, among siblings who played, quarreled, and whispered in corridors echoing with both laughter and intrigue. She was close to her mother, who instilled in her a love of knowledge and a sharp mind for debate. Unlike many young royal girls, Caroline was not content to sit quietly and smile. She listened, she questioned, she learned. Her position, however, remained secondary. She was not the eldest daughter whose marriage prospects might shape dynasties. She was not a son destined for inheritance. In the hierarchy of usefulness, Caroline ranked low. She was a daughter of a dynasty that valued her presence, but did not truly need her. That awareness, subtle at first, grew sharper with time. As the 1720s unfolded, Caroline watched the theater of power from a seat just outside the stage. In 1727, her father became King George II. The family shifted roles once again. Her mother ascended as queen, her elder brother as heir apparent. Her sisters were courted for their political value. Caroline herself gained a new title, Princess Caroline of Great Britain. But titles could not erase reality. She had no territory to govern. No political negotiations depended on her hand. She was part of the scenery, a royal figure present at ceremonies, dinners, and balls, but rarely at the heart of decisions. And yet, even in this half-shadow, there was a spark. Observers of the court noticed her intelligence. They recorded her wit, her lively conversation, her tendency to speak with sharp clarity on matters others might expect a woman to ignore. She was, in her own quiet way, remarkable. But in the eyes of kings and ministers, a princess with wit but no dowry, no marriage, and no realm was a puzzle. Intriguing, but not essential. This tension defined her early years in England. She belonged everywhere and nowhere. She was of royal blood, yet without the destiny of a crown. She lived inside palaces filled with grandeur, yet her path was always secondary, her importance contingent, her future undecided. Caroline of Great Britain entered history as a figure already destined to be overlooked. Her childhood had given her education, position, and privilege, but it had also marked her with invisibility. She was not born to reign, not chosen to marry brilliantly, not granted the authority of her sharp mind. She was simply a Hanoverian princess. And in the glittering courts of Europe, that role meant both everything and nothing. If Caroline's father gave her status, it was her mother who gave her spirit. Queen Caroline of Ansbach was unlike most consorts of her age. She was intelligent, ambitious, and unafraid to engage in matters of state. In a court dominated by men, she wielded a quiet but undeniable power. Ministers respected her judgment. Diplomats courted her favor. Even the king, George II, who often clashed with everyone else, leaned on her advice. For young Princess Caroline, this mother was more than a parent. She was a model, a compass, a shelter in the storm of dynastic politics. The little girl who wandered through the gilded corridors of St. James's Palace grew up watching her mother not merely endure the court, but shape it. Caroline of Ansbach encouraged her daughters to think, to read, to debate. She held salons where philosophers, scientists, and theologians spoke, and her daughters listened. The young princess absorbed it all. She learned to appreciate ideas, not just appearances. She discovered that a woman could be both royal and rational, both graceful and forceful. And yet, this strength came with a paradox. The very qualities that made her mother admired and feared also made her daughters less convenient on the marriage market. A princess trained to think too freely, to argue too openly, was less attractive as a diplomatic bride. Monarchs wanted wives who would obey, not spar. Caroline inherited more than her mother's name. She inherited her mother's independence of mind. She spoke with clarity. She carried herself with confidence. When courtiers underestimated her, she answered with wit that cut sharper than most politicians. Observers noticed. One remarked that Princess Caroline possessed her mother's temper of spirit, but not her station. In other words, she had the fire, but not the platform to use it. She was a bright flame burning in a shadowed corner of the palace. The relationship between mother and daughter was close, almost inseparable. Caroline often walked beside her mother, listening, watching, imitating. She absorbed the lessons of diplomacy, the art of balancing charm with authority. For a time, she must have believed that she too could play a role larger than the one fate had drawn for her. But history had other plans. George II's reign was marked by conflict, both abroad and at home. His children quarreled among themselves. His relationship with his heir, Frederick, was poisonous. Amid this chaos, Queen Caroline stood as the glue that held the family together. When ministers faltered, she steadied them. When her husband raged, she soothed him. When factions threatened to split the court, she mediated. Princess Caroline saw all this. She saw how much depended on her mother, and she saw, too, how fragile that strength really was. A woman could wield influence, but only so long as her health and her presence remained. In the 1730s, cracks began to appear. The Queen's health declined. She suffered from illness, but refused to show weakness. Even as pain gnawed at her, she continued to meet with ministers, continued to advise her husband, continued to serve as the silent pillar of a noisy monarchy. For her daughter, it was both inspiring and terrifying. Caroline must have felt pride in her mother's resilience, but she must also have felt dread. What would become of her, of all of them, if that pillar crumbled? The answer came in 1737. Queen Caroline of Ansbach died after a long and agonizing illness. She left behind a grieving king, a fractured family, and a daughter who suddenly found herself adrift. For Princess Caroline, the loss was catastrophic. Her mother had been her guide, her teacher, her protector. Without her, the court seemed colder, the corridors darker, the air heavier. The princess, who had once moved with energy and brightness, began to retreat into herself. She still had siblings, of course. She still had a father who was king. But none could replace the bond she had lost. Her sister Amelia offered companionship, but not the same anchor. Her brothers were preoccupied with politics and rivalry. Her father, distant and brusque, provided little comfort. Caroline of Great Britain became, in many ways, a living echo of her late mother, sharp, independent, but now untethered. Ministers no longer listened, courtiers no longer cared. She had inherited her mother's mind, but not her mother's stage. The throne was her father's, the crown her brother's. She was left with intelligence, but no arena to use it. And here lay the tragedy. The qualities that might have made her remarkable in another age became liabilities in her own. She was too strong for a pawn, yet too powerless for a queen. Too visible to vanish, yet too irrelevant to matter. Her mother had shown her what was possible. Life without her mother showed her what was not. From that moment on, Princess Caroline's path narrowed. The world would not see her as her mother's heir, but as a woman marked by loss. A princess with fire in her mind, but grief in her heart, and as the years moved forward, that grief would harden into something heavier. It would shape her choices, her reputation, her fate. Caroline was her mother's daughter, but without her mother, she was also something else, a woman destined to be forgotten. Every princess was expected to marry. That was her duty. That was her destiny. Through marriage, she would cement alliances, extend dynasties, and secure the chessboard of European politics. But for Caroline of Great Britain, every proposed match seemed to dissolve before her eyes. In her youth, whispers filled the corridors of Hanover and London alike. Suitors were suggested. Some were German princes, others from smaller houses that hovered at the edge of influence. One name that circulated was a Prince of Baden. Another, a minor noble from a Protestant court. Even a few English lords dared to dream of such a connection, though everyone knew it was impossible. Yet one by one, negotiations fell apart. The reasons were always practical on paper. Political winds shifted, alliances changed. The balance of Protestant and Catholic powers demanded caution. But beneath those excuses was something more personal, more elusive. Caroline was not pliant. She was not submissive. She was not the kind of princess who would sit silently beside a husband, smiling while others dictated her life. Ministers knew this. Suitors suspected it. Her sharp mind, her sharp tongue, her visible independence. These were not assets in the marketplace of royal marriages. They were liabilities. At court, people began to mutter. Why is Caroline not married? Why have her sisters moved forward while she remains behind? Was she too proud? Too difficult? Too opinionated? The whispers stung, but the reality was harsher. She was becoming invisible. A princess who never married was a princess who drifted to the margins. Without a husband, she had no foreign court to anchor her. Without children, she had no legacy to extend her bloodline. Without position, she had no influence. The irony was cruel. Caroline's intelligence, which might have made her a valuable queen consort, became the very trait that ensured she never would be one. She was too clever to be used, and therefore too dangerous to place. Her siblings advanced. Her brother Frederick, though despised by their father, carved his own sphere of power. Her sisters married into European families, their names stitched into the fabric of continental politics. Caroline remained, watching, waiting, fading. Some contemporaries pitied her, others mocked her. A few admired her courage in resisting matches she did not desire. But admiration could not erase the truth. She was passing into middle age, and still she was Princess Caroline the Unmarried. Marriage negotiations continued sporadically into her 20s and early 30s. At times, there was renewed hope. A small court in Germany seemed promising. A Protestant noble expressed interest. But the deals collapsed, always for the same reasons. Too little gain, too much risk. By then, her reputation preceded her. She was known as a woman of wit, yes, but also of temper. Some called her sharp, others called her cruel. She was clever, but she was also blunt. In an age where diplomacy demanded silk and honey, her voice carried too much steel. And so she became something rare in 18th century Europe. A royal woman without a husband, a princess not gowned in the role of wife or mother. Instead, she remained in the royal household, her position secure in name but precarious in purpose. For Caroline, the years must have felt like a slow suffocation. Every banquet reminded her of sisters who had moved on. Every ceremony reminded her of her absence from the political game. Every failed negotiation was another door closing, another path erased. And yet, she did not collapse into meek silence. She carried herself with defiance, as though daring fate to make her irrelevant. She spoke her opinions openly, sometimes too openly. She joined debates, sometimes embarrassing ministers with her quick retorts. She reminded the court and herself that she was still present, still sharp, still alive. But presence is not the same as power. A princess without marriage became a ghost within her own family. She was at every dinner, but at no table of decision. She was seen at court, but unseen in history. Caroline must have understood this cruel irony. She was not naive. She had grown up under a mother who taught her to see truth clearly. She knew that without marriage, she was becoming expendable. She knew that with each passing year, the question, what is to be done with her, grew louder in the halls of power. The answer, it turned out, was nothing. No crown, no wedding, no children, no dynasty of her own. By her mid-30s, the possibility of marriage had nearly vanished. She was too old by the standards of her era, her reputation too entrenched, her political usefulness too diminished. And so, the negotiations ceased. The letters stopped. The whispers died away. Princess Caroline of Great Britain was no longer a bride in waiting. She was simply waiting. For what, she could not have known. Perhaps for purpose, perhaps for companionship, perhaps for death. Her life had narrowed again, reduced to a role both privileged and empty. She remained in palaces filled with laughter, gossip, and power. Yet none of it belonged to her. Caroline had not failed to marry. Marriage had failed her. And in that failure, her fate as one of history's invisible princesses was sealed. If Caroline was denied the power of a crown, she clung to the power of her mind. In a court that prized appearances above thought, she refused to remain silent. Ministers spoke of wars and taxes, treaties and trade. Caroline listened. She interrupted. She challenged. She questioned. At times, she left seasoned politicians scrambling for words. One courtier once confessed, half in admiration and half in frustration, "Princess Caroline speaks with more wit than many ministers of state." It was not flattery. It was fact. She read widely. Not only scripture and poetry, but also philosophy and political essays. She followed the debates that shaped her brother's reign. She absorbed arguments, weighed them, and crafted her own opinions. Where others mouthed rehearsed courtesies, Caroline answered with sharpness that cut through pretense. But her sharpness was double-edged. It made her memorable in conversation, but dangerous in politics. A woman was expected to smile, not to spar, to nod, not to debate. When Caroline did both, she unsettled those around her. In the private apartments of St. James's Palace, she sometimes hosted her own gatherings, small circles of conversation, lit by candles, where philosophy and politics mingled with music. To her companions, she was stimulating company, lively and fearless. But to the wider court, she became known as difficult, proud, even severe. Her wit was not gentle. It carried bite. She could turn words into weapons. When she disliked someone, she did not hide it. When she disagreed, she said so. Few princes enjoyed being corrected by a woman, especially one with no crown to soften the blow. And yet, it was this sharp tongue that preserved her sense of self. Stripped of marriage prospects, ignored by political negotiators, Caroline fought to remain visible through intellect alone. It was a defiance, a refusal to fade quietly into obscurity. At times, she turned her wit inward into satire. She wrote little verses, clever but caustic, mocking those who pretended at greatness. Her humor was dry, often bitter. It was the laughter of someone who saw too much and belonged too little. This side of Caroline did not endear her to courtiers. To many, she was the spiteful princess, a woman whose words burned rather than warmed. Yet behind the sharpness lay something else: loneliness. Her mother was gone. Her sisters were married abroad. Her brothers fought their endless battles with their father. Caroline was left within the palace walls, her world shrinking even as her words tried to expand it. Sometimes, she sought solace in books. Other times, in music. The harpsichord was her companion, its notes filling rooms that otherwise echoed with silence. But no art could fully erase the truth. Her life was narrowing into a cycle of conversation, criticism, and retreat. And so, her reputation hardened. She was not remembered as beautiful. She was not celebrated as gracious. She was remembered for her tongue, for her wit, for the sting of her presence. But beneath that sting, there remained the spark of intelligence that once dazzled observers. She did not lose it. She only carried it more heavily as the years wore on. One could almost imagine her frustration. She had the mind to advise, but no office to hold. She had the insight to lead, but no place to rule. She had the spark of her mother, but not her mother's stage. In another time, perhaps, Caroline might have thrived. In another dynasty, she might have become a queen consort, guiding a king as her mother had done. In another century, she might have been a scholar, a philosopher, a woman celebrated for her words. But in 18th century Britain, her intelligence was both gift and curse. It made her memorable to those who met her, and it made her forgettable in the history written by men who measured worth in marriages and crowns. As the years crept on, Caroline's wit grew sharper, but her life grew smaller. She debated still, but fewer listened. She spoke still, but fewer cared. The candlelit circles dwindled. The corridors that once rang with her voice began to grow quiet. Her wit had once kept her alive in the eyes of others. Now, it only reminded them of her difference, her defiance, her failure to fit into the mold prepared for her. Caroline of Great Britain, the princess of wit and intelligence, lived in a palace of grandeur, yet walked always in shadow. Her mind blazed bright, but it illuminated little beyond her own solitude. And in that solitude, the seeds of her tragedy were already taking root. Grief has a way of reshaping lives. For Caroline, it came in the winter of 1737. Her mother was dying. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, the woman who had been her compass and her shield, lay in agony inside St. James's Palace. She had carried the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. Now she carried only pain. The illness, long hidden, had grown unbearable. Surgeons tried their crude remedies. None worked. The court whispered. The king wept. The children hovered, desperate, helpless. Caroline, the daughter who had followed her mother like a shadow, watched as the strongest woman she knew faded away. The queen bore her suffering with dignity. She endured operations without flinching, even when the pain was excruciating. George II himself broke down, crying that he could not live without her. But Caroline of Great Britain, the princess, could only stand in silence, her heart breaking. When death finally came, it was slow, cruel, and final. On November 20th, 1737, Queen Caroline of Ansbach died. She was 44. The palace fell into mourning. Black cloth draped the halls. Bells tolled across London. Ministers wore solemn faces. The king buried himself in grief. But no one grieved like Princess Caroline. Her mother had been more than a queen. She had been her teacher, her confidant, her protector. Without her, the world tilted. Without her, the palace seemed colder, emptier, harsher. Caroline withdrew. She no longer walked the corridors with the same confidence. She no longer spoke with the same fire. Her wit, once sharp and playful, began to carry only bitterness. She turned to her sister Amelia for comfort. The two women grew close, bound by shared loss and shared invisibility. Amelia, like Caroline, never married. She too remained in the shadows of the dynasty. Together, they leaned on each other. Two lonely figures inside a court that had little use for them. But no companionship could replace what was gone. Caroline's mother had been the anchor of her identity. Without her, Caroline was adrift. The court noticed. Ministers recorded how the princess grew more reclusive. Servants whispered that she was often found alone, sitting for hours, lost in thought. She read, she prayed, she brooded. The lively spark of her youth dimmed. Even her health seemed to falter under the weight of sorrow. She complained of headaches, fatigue, and the mysterious pains in her stomach that would haunt her until the end. Physicians tried their usual treatments, bleeding, purging, herbal concoctions, but nothing helped. Caroline's grief had become physical. Her body mirrored her heart. And yet, the world moved on. Her father continued to reign. Her brother plotted and schemed. Her sisters raised families abroad. Caroline remained behind, a woman frozen in mourning. The ceremonies of court life resumed, but she was no longer a figure of brightness within them. She was present, but absent. Seen, but unseen. It was during these years that her reputation hardened into something almost cruel. Courtiers described her as sour, harsh, difficult. Few remembered her as the witty, spirited girl who once sparred with ministers. Now they saw only the sharpness of grief. The princess who once laughed became the princess who scolded. The woman who once charmed became the woman who repelled. But beneath the bitterness lay something raw: loss. A daughter stripped of the only person who had truly understood her. A woman who had inherited her mother's mind, but not her mother's throne. A life already narrowed, now collapsing further. Perhaps Caroline herself understood this. Perhaps she knew that without her mother's influence, she would never escape the role of a sidelined princess. Perhaps she realized that history would forget her, just as politics had already dismissed her. And so she carried on, but not forward. She lived, but without momentum. She spoke, but without hope of being heard. She endured, but without purpose. The greatest loss of her life had not only taken her mother, it had taken her future. From that winter onward, Princess Caroline of Great Britain was not simply unmarried, not simply overlooked. She was a woman broken by grief. Her tragedy deepened not because she died young, but because she lived long enough to feel the emptiness stretch before her. And every day after 1737 was a reminder. The queen who had shaped her was gone, and with her, the light that had made life bearable. Sickness crept into her life slowly. It was not sudden, not violent, not a single blow. It was a shadow that lengthened year by year until it covered everything. Princess Caroline of Great Britain was never truly healthy after her mother's death. She complained of headaches. She grew fatigued easily. Most of all, she suffered from her stomach. The pains came without warning. At first, they were passing discomforts, a cramp, a heaviness, a restlessness after meals. Then they grew sharper, longer, unyielding. Doctors were summoned. Learned men of the 18th century, armed with their bleeding bowls, their leeches, their syrups, their theories of humors. They prescribed purges. They drained her blood. They ordered diets of milk, or of broth, or of herbs boiled until bitter. Each cure promised relief. None delivered it. Caroline endured them all. She sat while veins were opened. She swallowed potions that made her retch. She obeyed when told to restrict her food. And still, the pain returned. Some physicians suggested a rupture, perhaps a hernia. Others suspected obstructions of the bowels, a favorite phrase of the age. A few whispered of ulcers. None could say for certain. Medicine had no answers. What was certain was the effect. Caroline grew weaker. Her figure, once upright and commanding, stooped with discomfort. Her face tightened with lines of constant strain. Servants noticed how often she pressed her hand to her abdomen, as though to quiet the torment within. The court noticed too, but not always with sympathy. To some, she was simply a bitter princess whose ailments matched her sour temper. To others, she was an object of pity, a woman trapped in a body that betrayed her. Caroline herself bore it with a mixture of defiance and despair. At times, she forced herself into conversation, still quick, still sharp, as though words could shield her from pain. At other times, she withdrew into her rooms, curtains drawn, the palace outside muffled to silence. Illness changed her rhythm of life. She no longer appeared regularly at court gatherings. Banquets became ordeals. Music and dancing faded from her world. Instead, she spent long hours alone, reading, or simply lying still, waiting for pain to ebb. Her sister Amelia often sat with her, two unmarried women, bound by solitude, sharing long silences punctuated by sighs. But even Amelia could not lift the weight. The pain belonged to Caroline alone. And pain has a way of reshaping the mind. It makes hours longer. It dulls joy. It feeds bitterness. Caroline, once known for her cutting wit, now seemed consumed by it. Words that once sparkled now burned. Jests turned to jabs. Conversations soured into quarrels. Yet behind the sharpness was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from sleepless nights or heavy duties, but from unrelenting physical torment. Records describe her as plagued by a disorder of the bowels. They speak of violent pain, frequent and severe. They admit openly, no remedy brought relief. This was the cruel truth of 18th century medicine. A princess could command physicians, but she could not command cures. Rank protected her from poverty, but not from pain. Caroline's life shrank further. Rooms became her world. Her body became her prison. Her wit, her only weapon, now sounded less like strength and more like defense. A shield against invisibility, against pity, against despair. And yet, she endured, day after day, month after month, year after year. It was not a glorious endurance, not the kind sung in poems or praised in sermons. It was quieter, smaller, a daily negotiation with suffering, a struggle to maintain dignity while writhing inside, a decision to get out of bed when every breath ached. Those who remembered her in these years spoke less of grandeur, more of grimness. Caroline the witty had become Caroline the ill. Caroline the spirited had become Caroline the sour. And behind both reputations stood the same reality. A woman fighting an endless war inside her own body. Sometimes, she looked back on her mother's death, remembering how Queen Caroline had borne agony with stoic resolve. Perhaps she tried to imitate it. Perhaps she tried to believe that suffering could be dignified. But alone in her chambers, with pain twisting through her intestines, dignity must have felt very far away. And so, illness became her companion. It sat with her at meals she could barely eat. It walked with her down corridors she could barely cross. It lay with her in the silence of midnight. Illness was her shadow. Illness was her fate. And though she still had years left to live, Caroline must have known. This was not life in the full sense. This was survival. The shadow would not lift, it would only deepen. By the middle of the 18th century, Princess Caroline was still alive. But her life was narrowing into shadows. She had no husband, no children, no throne, no territory, nothing to anchor her in the dynastic map of Europe. She was a princess without a role, a royal figure with no purpose. Her brothers and sisters advanced. They married, quarreled, ruled, or raised dynasties. Their names appeared in treaties, in alliances, in the chronicles of Europe. Caroline's name rarely appeared anywhere at all. She lived mostly in London, moving between St. James's Palace and other royal residences. The grandeur of her surroundings could not hide the truth. She was present in the palace, but absent in history. Seen in the flesh, but invisible on the stage. Courtiers whispered about her temper. They called her sharp, bitter, difficult. Some avoided her entirely, unwilling to face her cutting remarks. To them, she was a shadow haunting the halls, a reminder of potential wasted. But beneath the gossip lay a harsher truth. Caroline was lonely. The death of her mother had torn away her anchor. Her sister Amelia remained by her side, yes, but companionship could not erase emptiness. Friends thinned out. Family became preoccupied with politics and their own lives. Caroline, unmarried and ill, had little to offer in return. Her life became a routine of repetition. Mornings of reading, often alone. Afternoons in conversation with Amelia or a few attendants. Evenings spent quietly, sometimes with music, sometimes with silence. No banquets, no diplomacy, no brilliance. In her youth, she had sparred with ministers, her wit remembered by those who admired intelligence. In her later years, she was remembered more for sourness than for sparkle. The fire of her mind remained, but it burned in a room no one entered. The palace itself seemed to mirror her decline. St. James's, once the beating heart of monarchy, was already fading into obsolescence, overshadowed by other residences. Its walls were cold, its chambers drafty, its corridors dim. Caroline lived within those spaces as though she, too, were part of the furniture, still there, but overlooked. What must it have felt like? To be the daughter of a king, the sister of rulers, yet to be nothing more than a presence. To watch history pass by, written by men who barely glanced in her direction. Perhaps Caroline resented it. Perhaps she embraced it. Perhaps in her more defiant moods, she reminded herself that she was not a pawn, not a tool for others' ambitions. But defiance is a hard diet when paired with isolation, and illness made it worse. The stomach pains never left her. They dictated her movements, controlled her moods, shaped her days. Pain isolates as much as reputation. It drives others away. It makes every hour heavier. Caroline became the subject of ridicule as much as pity. To some, she was the cranky aunt of the dynasty. To others, she was tragic, a woman left behind by history. To herself, she was likely both. Wounded by loss, embittered by circumstance, trapped by her own body. Her world grew quieter. The great events of the kingdom, wars abroad, debates in parliament, shifts of alliances, unfolded without her. She was not asked, not consulted, not needed. Once, she had been a girl full of promise, clever, sharp, independent. Now, she was a woman with no stage, no script, no role. The tragedy of Caroline was not that she died young. It was that she lived long enough to feel forgotten while still alive. Imagine the corridors she walked, long galleries hung with portraits of monarchs and heroes, names immortalized in oil and canvas. Yet her own face, her own name, carried little weight. She was there, but she was not celebrated. She was flesh, but not memory. And so she faded, slowly, quietly. Year by year, she became less visible, less significant, less remembered. The court moved on. History moved on. Caroline remained behind, like a figure painted into the background of a larger scene. A life of fading light. Not extinguished, not erased, but dimmed until the glow was almost gone. The 1750s were not kind to Princess Caroline. She was no longer young. The sharp wit that once drew attention now earned only avoidance. Her body, weakened by decades of stomach pain, betrayed her daily. Her spirit, dulled by grief and solitude, seemed to fold inward. The palace around her bustled with life. Ministers rushing to audiences, courtiers whispering in corridors, foreign envoys attending glittering receptions. Caroline was there, but not part of it. She occupied rooms in St. James's Palace, her world reduced to walls, curtains, attendants, and silence. She had been born into a dynasty that stretched across Europe. Her sisters married into princely houses, her brothers shaped politics, quarreled with kings, and carved their places in history. Caroline had none of that. She was still the unmarried princess, a label that clung to her like dust that could not be brushed away. As her health declined, so did her appearances. She no longer attended the ceremonies that gave rhythm to royal life. No more processions, no more great banquets, no more courts filled with jewels and music. Instead, she lived in seclusion, glimpsed rarely, spoken of even less. Her sister Amelia remained close, visiting often, keeping her company. Their bond was one of shared invisibility. Two royal women, both unmarried, both sidelined, both fading. They spoke quietly. They walked slowly. They existed, side by side, as reminders of what the dynasty chose not to use. But even Amelia could not fill the emptiness. Companionship eased the silence, but did not erase it. Caroline had once imagined herself sparring in debates, perhaps guiding policy like her mother had done. Instead, she was left with memories of what never came. Servants recorded her moods. At times, she was irritable, snapping at those who tended her. At other times, she fell into long silences, staring at the fire as though lost in another world. Her temper was the court's gossip. Her loneliness was its secret. The medical reports grew darker. Violent pains, unrelenting disorders of the bowels. No relief from remedies. She was bled again and again. She was given herbs, broths, tinctures, diets, and purges. Nothing worked. Each treatment left her weaker. Each failure deepened her despair. Caroline's identity shrank until illness defined her. She was not remembered as witty, not remembered as clever, not remembered as the spirited daughter of a queen. She was remembered as sick. In this decline, she became almost ghost-like. When she appeared in public, she was pale, drawn, fragile. Courtiers who once endured her sharp words now looked at her with pity, or avoided her altogether. Her presence no longer inspired fear or admiration. It inspired discomfort. She knew it. That may have been the worst of it. She was aware of her own fading. She saw herself becoming irrelevant. She felt herself being forgotten, not after death, but in life itself. To exist in history's margins while still breathing, that was her true prison. And yet, she endured. Not gracefully, not triumphantly, but stubbornly. Every day she rose, even if rising meant only sitting by a window, wrapped in shawls, watching the city blur in the distance. Every day she faced pain, even if it conquered her. Every day she remained alive, though life offered her little more than survival. As the 1750s drew to a close, her decline became undeniable. She seldom left her rooms. She seldom saw beyond the palace gates. London roared with energy, trade, politics, and gossip. But Caroline heard only fragments. The world moved forward. She stayed behind. Her attendants, loyal if weary, tended her as best they could. They recorded her fits of agony, her endless nights of tossing in pain, her whispered prayers for relief. Relief never came. The tragedy of her final years was not just in the sickness, it was in the silence. No husband held her hand. No children knelt at her bedside. No crowds mourned her fading. She had lived as a princess, but would die as a shadow. In another family, in another fate, her mind might have made her memorable. Instead, her suffering defined her. The witty girl became the bitter woman. The spirited princess became the forgotten invalid. And still, the hours dragged on. In the end, her last years were not marked by scandal, triumph, or glory. They were marked by waiting, waiting for pain to subside, waiting for sleep to come, waiting for death. The palace where she lived was filled with history. Kings had walked its halls, queens had died in its chambers, ministers had plotted within its rooms. Yet Caroline of Great Britain remained in her corner of it, quiet, hidden, barely noted. Her final years were not the blaze of a life well lived. They were the dim glow of a candle left too long, burning only because it had not yet been extinguished. Caroline was alive, yes, but she was already forgotten. The 1750s were not kind to Princess Caroline. She was no longer young. The sharp wit that once drew attention now earned only avoidance. Her body, weakened by decades of stomach pain, betrayed her daily. Her spirit, dulled by grief and solitude, seemed to fold inward. The palace around her bustled with life. Ministers rushing to audiences, courtiers whispering in corridors, foreign envoys attending glittering receptions. Caroline was there, but not part of it. She occupied rooms in St. James's Palace, her world reduced to walls, curtains, attendants, and silence. She had been born into a dynasty that stretched across Europe. Her sisters married into princely houses, her brothers shaped politics, quarreled with kings, and carved their places in history. Caroline had none of that. She was still the unmarried princess, a label that clung to her like dust that could not be brushed away. As her health declined, so did her appearances. She no longer attended the ceremonies that gave rhythm to royal life. No more processions, no more great banquets, no more courts filled with jewels and music. Instead, she lived in seclusion, glimpsed rarely, spoken of even less. Her sister Amelia remained close, visiting often, keeping her company. Their bond was one of shared invisibility. Two royal women, both unmarried, both sidelined, both fading. They spoke quietly. They walked slowly. They existed, side by side, as reminders of what the dynasty chose not to use. But even Amelia could not fill the emptiness. Companionship eased the silence, but did not erase it. Caroline had once imagined herself sparring in debates, perhaps guiding policy like her mother had done. Instead, she was left with memories of what never came. Servants recorded her moods. At times, she was irritable, snapping at those who tended her. At other times, she fell into long silences, staring at the fire as though lost in another world. Her temper was the court's gossip. Her loneliness was its secret. The medical reports grew darker. Violent pains, unrelenting disorders of the bowels. No relief from remedies. She was bled again and again. She was given herbs, broths, tinctures, diets, and purges. Nothing worked. Each treatment left her weaker. Each failure deepened her despair. Caroline's identity shrank until illness defined her. She was not remembered as witty, not remembered as clever, not remembered as the spirited daughter of a queen. She was remembered as sick. In this decline, she became almost ghost-like. When she appeared in public, she was pale, drawn, fragile. Courtiers who once endured her sharp words now looked at her with pity, or avoided her altogether. Her presence no longer inspired fear or admiration. It inspired discomfort. She knew it. That may have been the worst of it. She was aware of her own fading. She saw herself becoming irrelevant. She felt herself being forgotten, not after death, but in life itself. To exist in history's margins while still breathing, that was her true prison. And yet, she endured. Not gracefully, not triumphantly, but stubbornly. Every day she rose, even if rising meant only sitting by a window, wrapped in shawls, watching the city blur in the distance. Every day she faced pain, even if it conquered her. Every day she remained alive, though life offered her little more than survival. As the 1750s drew to a close, her decline became undeniable. She seldom left her rooms. She seldom saw beyond the palace gates. London roared with energy, trade, politics, and gossip. But Caroline heard only fragments. The world moved forward. She stayed behind. Her attendants, loyal if weary, tended her as best they could. They recorded her fits of agony, her endless nights of tossing in pain, her whispered prayers for relief. Relief never came. The tragedy of her final years was not just in the sickness, it was in the silence. No husband held her hand. No children knelt at her bedside. No crowds mourned her fading. She had lived as a princess, but would die as a shadow. In another family, in another fate, her mind might have made her memorable. Instead, her suffering defined her. The witty girl became the bitter woman. The spirited princess became the forgotten invalid. And still, the hours dragged on. In the end, her last years were not marked by scandal, triumph, or glory. They were marked by waiting, waiting for pain to subside, waiting for sleep to come, waiting for death. The palace where she lived was filled with history. Kings had walked its halls, queens had died in its chambers, ministers had plotted within its rooms. Yet Caroline of Great Britain remained in her corner of it, quiet, hidden, barely noted. Her final years were not the blaze of a life well lived. They were the dim glow of a candle left too long, burning only because it had not yet been extinguished. Caroline was alive, yes, but she was already forgotten. They buried her in Westminster Abbey. A princess among kings, a daughter of a dynasty that shaped Europe. Yet even in death, she was overshadowed. No grand monument bore her name. No great historian paused long over her memory. She slipped quietly into the ground, as quietly as she had lived. Princess Caroline of Great Britain, 44 years, no husband, no children, no dynasty, no legacy. For many, that would have been the end of the story. A minor royal, forgotten even by her own age. But her life tells us something more, something larger than a single name carved into stone. It tells us about invisibility. Caroline's fate was not unique. Across Europe, royal daughters were born and then bartered. Some married into foreign courts. Others became queens, mothers, pawns in dynastic games. But those who did not fit, those too sharp, too independent, too inconvenient, were left behind. Their stories were not written. Their lives faded in silence. Caroline was one of them. Her wit, her mind, her spirit could have mattered. In another century, she might have been a philosopher, a patron, a leader. Instead, she became a footnote, a shadow, a princess whom history passed over. Her tragedy was not only her death in pain, it was that the world barely noticed she had lived at all. And yet, in remembering her, we reclaim something. We remember that behind every crown and every court were human beings, not just kings and generals, but daughters and sisters, women who laughed, who grieved, who suffered, women whose names deserve to be spoken even centuries later. Caroline reminds us that silence itself can be a form of injustice. To be erased, to be ignored, to be forgotten. This is a fate as cruel as illness. Her life asks a question that echoes still. How many others were lost to silence? How many princesses lived and died in shadows, erased by the history that chose not to see them? Caroline's story, quiet as it was, gives them a voice. The halls of Westminster still hold her tomb. Tourists pass by, hardly pausing, eyes fixed on the grand monuments of kings and queens. Few bend to read her name. Few remember who she was. But we can remember. We can tell her story. We can pull her from silence. Caroline of Great Britain, a princess who never ruled, a daughter who never married, a woman who endured illness, grief, and invisibility. A life that reminds us that history is not only crowns and battles, but also the quiet tragedies of those left behind. Her forgotten fate belongs, now, to us. To remember, to reflect, to tell again. Because in remembering, she is no longer invisible. If you've been moved by this story of a life erased by silence, don't let it vanish again. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled for more forgotten histories, more voices long buried, more truths hidden in the shadows of time.